Hello and welcome to a Conquest, the Last Argument of Kings event recap. Clash at the Coast 2025 has wrapped up a week and a bit ago at time of recording, and saw players from 4 or 5 different states or territories across Australia travel, in some cases considerable distances, to compete in this 24-person event. Among their number was a considerable Australian Capital Territory delegation, myself included, which means I can do this video about how I played and how the event went. In that vein, we're going to firstly go through the list that I played. Now, I have covered all of the lists you'll see today in the list review video for Clash of the Coast, which went live before the event. But in this case, we're going to go through my list just in a little bit more detail, talking in particular about how it seeks to play a game. And then we'll go through each of the 5 rounds that I played. Now, these will be high-level recaps in each case. I don't have enough pictures to go through all 10 rounds, and that's not germane to the discussion in any case. But I will talk about my opponent's list, again, maybe in a little bit more detail, and how the matchup and the game played out. What were the key decisions that each player made? How did each player deploy and unpack their forces? What were the critical decisions that were made, and what critical things occurred that influenced the outcome of the game? Now, that means that we've got 5 full rounds to cover, so let's get into my list and get cracking. Now, as a quick reminder, I played a high activation count feudal imperial 100 kingdoms list. We've got a noble lord with Caliburn and eccentric fighting style, who is an absolute premier blender. He's in a unit of 5 men-at-arms with a seasoned veteran, and then in his warband we have otherwise an MSU of 3 non-veteran longbowmen. We then have the same again, except no Caliburn or eccentric this time, so that is a generic naked noble lord for 80 points in 5 men-at-arms with seasoned veteran. Each of the noble lords will be using their ability to make the men-at-arms that are in there, that they are leading veterans, and then we have 3 non-veteran longbows. We've then got the first of 2 chapter mages. This one has School of Fire, and it's in a unit of mercenary crossbowmen. We then have the second of 2 chapter mages and our dynastic ally, making this an imperial list. She has Art of War and School of Water, and she's in a mercenary crossbow list unit. And then we have a mounted noble lord who is the warlord in order to make all regiments in his warband veteran. He has no upgrades, and he has 3 household knights, 3 household knights, 3 longbows who will be veteran, 3 longbows who will be veteran. This means the list has 2 units of men-at-arms, 2 units of crossbows, 2 units of household knights, and 4 units of longbows. Relatively straightforward and kind of forgiving in the ordering of the command stack. Now, while this list is a very high activation count, it's 16 activations, that is not where you kind of want to focus when thinking about how the list plays. More important to how the list plays is the composition of troops and the fact that this is a feudal, but more importantly, imperial list. So, the composition of troops. Firstly, everything in the list is light or medium, which means that it arrives on the board quite aggressively. Secondly, you have the Imperial Supremacy or Army-wide ability to give 1 infantry regiment, Imperial Infantry Regiment, or 2 Imperial Infantry Regiments each turn, Vanguard 5. This means that the list gets up the board aggressively quickly, and because it is a 100 Kingdoms list, even light regiments will get a scoring bonus if they have at least 4 stands, sufficient to give them a +1 resolve to their resolve from size, which means it can score aggressively. Now, the longbows are all MSUs, they can't score, they're too small, but the 2 units of mercenary crossbowmen with chapter mages have 4 stands in them thanks to the presence of the chapter mage, which means they can score. And then we have Vanguard infantry and cavalry able to move onto zones aggressively as well. That does not actually make this a scenario-oriented list, but what it does do is unpack the most important thing about how the list plays. What this list wants to do, under ideal circumstances, right? Sometimes you have to adapt, but under ideal circumstances, what this list seeks to do is claim and then cede space. It claims space on the board by moving up really aggressively, using all of that vanguard movement and high speed and lots of lights and mediums to unpack a long way up the board. And then it uses the fact that it has light scoring and lots of mediums to score early. And both of those things together provide the list the space to then seed and fall back for attritional advantage. So what the list wants to do is take a bunch of territory and take a bunch of points and then give that ground and those points up, like fritter away the scenario lead very intentionally in order to have multiple successive turns of good attritional plays. Effectively, it moves forward and then it moves backwards. And it uses all of that backward movement, which it can do safely because it's taken territory in the first place with its vanguard movement, and it's taken points to give it the breathing room by having early scoring to pepper and pepper and pepper and pepper and put all of this range damage into its opponents, because this list has 20 stands capable of making ranged attacks, 2 of which are wizards who also have offensive spells. And all of that damage pressures your opponents forward, whittles them away, which means that when they finally hit your lines, if you have used that space that you've taken to establish a good formation, you can then take melee fights that are advantageous to you against an enemy who has been bled absolutely dry. In a sense, the list plays almost like the old fantasy of Wood Elves, where you move forward and you move backwards, firing and firing and firing as you go. Now, it's not a tactic that works against every single opposing lists. There are mechanical enemy compositions that can undo this. Very, very good healing, for example, or large quantities of Tenacious are both effective against this kind of chip damage. But in general, I have found that as a basic strategy to employ, it is very powerful. Not everyone necessarily knows how to play against it. Backwards movement in Conquest is kind of rare because the game makes it difficult, but this list can do it. And if you're careful, after moving forward and then moving backwards with your light regiments, you can establish formations that are themselves just very, very strong. Kind of the platonic ideal turn 3 for this list is one in which your longbows have moved forward and then have conducted a fighting retreat, and on turn 2 and turn 3, the Vanguard men-at-arms regiments and the Knights have pushed forward, particularly the men-at-arms, have pushed forward over the top, leaving you with a nice classic 100 Kingdoms formation of shields in front, bows behind. And if you have that formation and your opponent is lined up across from you and a decisive fight is about to occur, but you have spent 3 turns firing 20 stands of ranged regiments into your opponent, the subsequent attrition is probably going to be pretty advantageous in your favor. Now, a few other things to note. If your opponent plays keep away and is able to kind of like resist the range poke, you still have quite good threat ranges with this list. The Imperial Supremacy is really only going to do much of anything on those men-at-arms regiments, but if you position your formation correctly to allow some nice wide-angle reforms, you can get quite a long threat range with those men-at-arms. And you've got 2 very reasonable cavalry regiments on top of that as well. Now, finally, and this really is just the final point, it is also a 16 activation list. 16 activations is kind of beyond the pale in terms of how Conquest normally plays. And that activation count gives you a lot of kind of predictability and control, particularly over how the back end of the turn might play out, but it is not as important to the list as it kind of looks. That kind of activation count is a nice way of beating other lists that make sacrifices to get too high activation counts. There are like 14 activation lists that you will occasionally see in the wild that have had to stretch themselves pretty thin to get to that, and the last thing those lists want to see is someone who still out-activates them by a significant margin. But more important for the activation count is it just gives your turns a relatively predictable tempo, and it lets you do things like fritter away the first part of the turn with just character activations and stuff, and then know that you will have 4 or 5 activations more than your opponent at the end of the turn, in which you can do things like have your longbows shoot. And so the fact that the longbows will, in the early game, be at the bottom of your turn stack means that your opponent does not have the luxury of waiting until your longbows have activated and then surging forward into their range. They have to walk forward into the range of the longbows because you out-activate them, and because they do that, it buys you in effect 1 more turn of shooting than you might otherwise get. It will also occasionally open up some specific plays, especially with the Fire Wizard. Now, she is the kind of piece where if you get an opportunity for her, she can really pay off, because you can have the mercenary crossbows like march forward, and then she can throw a firebolt. And there are a lot of regiments in the game that have these days that have a degree of protection against ranged attacks that don't necessarily translate directly to protection against spellcasting. For example, squires, veteran squires in 100 Kingdoms. She has a means of dealing with them when all of the poke from longbows wouldn't. But because you need 2 actions for her to really pop off, you need to be able to safely move the crossbows forward and then safely fire off the firebolt. That's one of the other ways that you can use your activations. And I've used that to good effect, for example, against Spires players who do not like it when you put morale-causing armor-piercing 1 shots into marksman clones, for example. But she is generally a high danger piece if you can kind of capitalize on the plays that she can make. Now, in the early game, you'll be using your characters, etc., to kind of like waste time at the beginning of the turn and then firing your longbows. In the mid-game, when you're waiting for that decisive clash, but your opponent is in range, you can switch to having the longbows be early activations, the wizards be early activations, and then have all of the melee units kind of go last. That gives you the same luxury that you had with the longbows in the early game, where you can kind of guarantee that if you're going to get a charge and a clash, it's your opponent that has to walk into your threat range first. But to emphasize, those are all kind of like nice luxuries to have. They are less important to how the list plays than the fact that it is a light and medium centric list that wants to move forward, score, and then pull back. If you wanted to change this list to reduce the activation count a little bit, something that would probably strengthen the list overall is to cut one of the non-veteran longbowman regiments. That's 140 points. With 140 points, you can buy one extra stand in each of the veteran longbow regiments and have points left over for 2 stands to go into one of the men-at-arms regiments, i.e. the Calladburn one, because that's very dangerous. Like, that probably strengthens the list overall, although I absolutely didn't have the models for that, but that's just an example of how you could easily give up 1 activation, or even 2 if you wanted to cut Art of War, and potentially come out stronger overall. So, with that rundown of how the list is intended to play, let's jump into the first game where that doesn't work at all. So round 1 would be against Jacob's Nords. I covered this list as I covered all of these lists in the Clash and the Coast list video, and this one I believe I said was more or less the most on meta of the Nord lists, although not absolutely on meta. If I was to try and describe a pure meta Nords list, it would 100% include a Varga Lord, because the Varga Lord at time of recordings Warband ability is just obscenely powerful as far as force multipliers go. This is a little bit more moderate, it is more human kind of person-centric, albeit with a giant. So there are some concessions being made here, and indeed Jacob is a new-ish player. So what he's got is, as a reminder, a Volya in a unit of 5 Valkyries. She is the Warlord, and she has Coils of the Serpent to let those Valkyries go up to Evasion 2. We then have a Konungur with no special rules, not that he needs them. He's 7 attacks with Clash 4, Cleave 1, in a unit of Steel Chosen, and then backed up by a further 2 units of Bow Chosen. Now, Bow Chosen are a relatively short range regiment with just 14 inches, but they are still very dangerous if they get a volley, particularly against me, where I am relying on Hardened to kind of weather through chip damage. Precise Shot doesn't give a fig about that. We then have a second Volya in a unit of Raiders. She'll be in one of the units of Raiders with Captains. One of the nice things about this list is that it's being kind of judicious in terms of it's not just automatically putting a captain into every Raider regiment, it's putting captains in just enough Raider regiments to be able to score reliably and not kind of wasting the 20 points per unit on units that aren't going to be scoring. So she's got Raiders without Captain, Raiders with Captain, and then Raiders with Captain, and then we have in the third warband a Shaman, Raiders with Captain, and a Mountain Jotnar. Now, this Mountain Jotnar is a piece that's going to be going to medium in the next update, and like that will make it much more viable. But I will note that this list kind of hits the sweet spot in terms of runouts, where it is very, very light-centric, and it has just the one heavy, which means that you will always have your heavy on turn 3. You are not at risk of having your reinforcement rolls kind of crap out. It's a strong, consistent early game style of list. Yes, the Konungur is a little bit off meta. Yes, it would probably better be a Varga Lord if we were talking about Clash of the Coast and the rules that were enforced at the time. But otherwise, this is basically just a solidly standard Nords list, sitting at about 70% on meta and quite capable of doing well. And in particular, it is mostly mechanically well suited to matching up against mine. Of all of the lists that I would play over the course of the weekend, this was the one that was best able to just completely no-sell the early ranged poke. And that's for 2 reasons. The first reason is that basically all of the things that are on the board early are going to be Evasion 2. In fact, all of them will be. So the armor piercing on the longbows is irrelevant. And the second thing is that all of the raiders, which will comprise the bulk of the early presence elements, have Tenacious. And that means that, particularly on an unaimed shot, the expected damage from a unit of raiders, from a unit of longbows into a unit of raiders, is almost nothing. It's like 1 wound maybe. And then there are 2 Volyas who have healing spells, which means this list is extremely capable of sustaining through all of the early chip damage that I would do, and it is one of the only lists in the entire event that would be on the board more aggressively than me, and importantly, would be on the board early with things that would beat what I have that is on the board early. So if Raiders get into melee with, in fact, if any of these units get into melee with longbows, they will crush them out, and they are fast and aggressive enough to threaten that. Now, where the matchup swings back into my favor a little bit is when everything is on the board. Because once everything is on the board, I can start putting men-at-arms and knights forward, and a unit of raiders into a unit of knights with a lord nearby is a very uneven matchup, because those knights are effectively defense 4 untouchable against the raiders, and there is just no cleave. There is no cleave on the raiders. There is no cleave. Well, there's line breaker, to be fair, on the steel chosen. But lots of what this list wants to do is just put out kind of lots of hits, and having hardened against, say, the Coninger, but more generally just solid enough defense and a big stack of wounds, and untouchable for the rerolls, means that I can pick up entire regiments of his at a time. Like, it's not too difficult for me to put down a raider regiment with any of my units if they charge and clash, but it's difficult for any of his regiments, maybe including the steel chosen with the Coninger if they get a charge, to put down any of my regiments. And so the fight, once the mediums are present, swings in my favor, and then potentially swings back a little bit once the giant arrives. It is hardened, it has a big wound count, and it has a lot of cleave and terror. Cleave and terror in high enough quantities, cleave especially in high enough quantities, but then terror generally. My list has got no resolve defenses. Its resolve is not particularly good, and so connecting with plenty of attacks that themselves have terror is one of the ways of blowing out the regiments that I have. Overall, this is a matchup that is fragile in the early game for me, and then kind of swings back my way, provided I don't get connected with and overwhelmed early. And that means that I have to abandon the initial plan of taking and then ceding space, because I just can't take territory against this list, especially when we get into how the early turns play out. So this scenario in this case is off balance. That's going to give us these 2 objective zones and then 4 objectives. And in terms of notable terrain, we have 2 large, relatively central forest areas, and then we have 2 big impassable areas shielding the objectives, and some water spattered around as well. Now, the tempo of this game early on would be heavily dictated by the fact that Jacob succeeded every single light reinforcement roll, and I succeeded just a few. That would put the activation count at something like 8 to 6 in Jacob's favor early, and he would retain that activation count for the first few turns. Now, the counterplay, the sole counterplay to this, is to take advantage of the fact that Jacob has to commit the huge bulk of his army before I do. He has to deploy all of those raider units that have arrived, all of those bow chosen units that have arrived this turn, whereas I am going to be able to run everything out kind of a turn behind, and as such, try and build a counter deployment against him. And what that meant is that I was able to an extent, refuse a flank, win by decisive force concentration in one area, and then sweep across the board. We've sort of like sketched it out here, but what you can see is that there are Nords concentrated relatively heavily in the center of their line, kind of to the left. There is a little unit of raiders coming up and around to have a sneaky go at my objective, and then just kind of like raiders and bow chosen. It's not 100% clear, but the units that are underlined in red bow chosen on my opponent's side, and then just everything else is raiders with spellcasters, etc., etc. My response is to occupy just the bottom right corner of the screen, as you can see. Those units will move up, and then they will pull back. And once they pull back, knights and men-at-arms will move over the top of them to form line and take the fight to the enemy. Now, Jacob's got relatively limited capacity to respond to that. What he will do is he'll bring his big Volya brick on my right flank, and the Steel Chosen will come up behind those raiders that are in between the 2 main forces. But because I'm able to counter deploy, basically each time I allocate force, I'm allocating it to a position where that allocation means I'm likely to win in that area of the battlefield. Now, this would still have been dicey because I am playing outside of my comfort zone with such a high activation count arrayed against me early in the game because of how Jacob's reinforcement rolls went, except that Jacob was one of those players where I mentioned that he is new, and if there was one sort of like thing I could point out as one of the mistakes that Jacob made this turn, he was fairly good at positioning his army. He was particularly good at unpacking it. One of the things that you often see novice players do is they'll get jammed up on themselves. That didn't happen at all. The run out on everything that Jacob did was really clean. Nothing got in anything's way. Units were always positioned effectively to mutually support one another. The only kind of mistake that Jacob made was to lean into something that is very common in new players, which is to assume that since you can move forward, you should move forward. And there were a couple of situations where raiders and the Steel Chosen as well made like long pushes toward me, and I just gave some ground and then hit them when it was time for me to do so and cleaned them up. A unit of raiders on my right flank and the entire unit of Steel Chosen both got completely cleaned up before they really had a chance to do anything, and that let me collapse that flank and then turn in. This produced a situation where I was able to hold on my left flank with some relatively limited forces, just baiting out and engaging raider units, picking off the Bow Chosen when there was time to do so, but decisively win on the right and push through and around. That was enough to produce what would end up being a 48-8 win 200 Kingdoms, leveraging what ultimately was a slightly superior late game strength. And by late game, I mean once both armies are fully entrenched, fully deployed, against the more early game strength of the Nord. So one game down, one win in the bag, and proceeding on to round 2. Now, for round 2, we are playing against Ryan, also from Nara, and his Dwegon. This was one of 2 Holdreg-led lists at Clash at the Coast, and I was actually quite excited to play against one of these, because despite the fact that it's something that Tom, one of my local players, has been getting into and getting fairly good at, I hadn't had a chance to actually sit down and play against anything other than Tempered Creed Dweg in some time. So this promised to be quite interesting. What is in the list is we have firstly a Warlord Holdreg with Mimancer's Eye. He's in a big block of 5 Initiates. We then have a unit of 3 Hold Ballistae and 2 Ironclad Drakes. We then have a second Hold Reg in a slightly smaller unit of 4 Initiates and 3 Hold Warriors. Now, Ryan has given up the opportunity to do something hilarious here and to take 2 more Drakes. Instead, he has a unit of Fireforged, a unit of a Ardent Kerouac with Focused, and 2 units of Flame Berserkers. Now, frankly, this is not a highly optimized list. In fact, I would say if we compare it to, for example, if we go back to the Clash video where we do the list recaps and we talk through Tom's list, for example, you will see a much wider list with a lot more regiments making full advantage of the scoring bonus that is given to command stands, and generally a more aggressive and scenario-oriented bent. This list is Holdreg Warlord and things. Now, as it happens, some of those things are quite good against my list. In particular, Ironclad Drakes are an absolute terror against 100 Kingdoms. The combination of being able to land a surprisingly large number of attacks thanks to good native clash and relentless blows, plus good impacts, plus cleave 2, brutal impact 2, and terror, makes Ironclad Drakes, particularly if they charge clash, very good at picking up or otherwise like thoroughly defeating any melee 100 Kingdoms regiments, kind of just generally, but especially in my list. What is extremely common is for the combination of the impact attacks and the clash to, at minimum, break the regiment before resolve rolls are made, just because of how much damage that they can do. And because of that, then you have just terrifying resolve against terrifying against resolve of crap all, which means that the regiment almost invariably shatters to resolve checks. I have had more units than I can count just comfortably one-shot by Ironclad Drakes, and that is in large part due to the fact that, yep, I'm running things that I'm not running Theist, for example, in this. I'm not running Resolve Insurance. I'm also not putting enough stands in my regiments to survive this kind of attack. One of the changes I mentioned you could make early on is you could add extra stands, like as many as 3 extra stands to the Caliburn Eccentric Fighting Style Lords regiment, and that would make it actually capable of more or less surviving this kind of an ironclad attack. I am running my units at kind of like their minimum viable size. That does mean 5 stands plus a character for the men-at-arms. And one of the consequences of that is that Ironclad Drakes especially will blow you out. However, apart from that, this list is a bunch of Dwagom stuff, and it's good, but as I mentioned in the list review video, it doesn't have any special army rules. It's just got the supremacy of the Holdreg, and while that is nice, it doesn't change the fact that many of the units in the list are fundamentally unsupported. And Ironclad Drakes in particular, for example, there is a huge delta between, for example, an Ironclad Drake that has a Steel Shaper Supremacy behind it with multiple tokens and Hardened 1 from a Steel Shaper spell, and an Ironclad Drake with literally none of that. And that basically means that as far as the matchup goes, I cannot afford to be incautious, because if those Ironclads engineer a breakthrough and push through my lines, they will just gobble up unit after unit after unit, but provided I can hold and contain them, the rest of the list is fairly manageable. Fireforged are a little bit of a nightmare because they are so durable and they will win basically any battery on battery fight. And of course, initiates are very durable, but it's the ironclads that are the main threat, and if I can just contain those, I can more or less hold the game in my favor. Now, for this game, I would have the advantage in terms of early arrivals because there were just 2 units of Flame Berserkers from my opponent, but Flame Berserkers are capable of moving very quickly up the board, and you do tend to need to seed ground against them, maybe slightly faster than usual. That's fine though, because if they are pushing in on you that aggressively, you can get them as a pick. You can take those units out, and knock them off the board, not necessarily for free, but for relatively limited damage, and then push with the now significant force advantage you have into the space that they previously occupied. That's one of the reasons why, for example, Tom's list is a bit more scary, because he's very disciplined and he has a lot more light regiments than Ryan did, and so he can present significantly greater force saturation. Now, as it happened in this particular scenario, we're playing head-to-head. Head-to-head is often a little bit of a nightmare against Dweg, but it's a nightmare against Dweg because it lets a Tempered Creed list build a very effective box and just kind of like comfortably win on scenario because you cannot match their force concentration. That is not the case against Hold Reg Dweg. And in this game, I was able to adopt kind of a wide-ish frontage, hoping that he would respond. Now, he didn't exactly, but enough things were able to go right that the game was okay and went in my direction. In particular, the Berserker committal early was too aggressive. That was one of the main mistakes that Ryan made. So we can see this movement here along my right flank. The 2 units of Flame Berserkers pushed aggressively up the field to seize the central, or the right side in this case, the large zone in head-to-head. And although they did make contact, in fact, one of them got a charge on a unit of Household Knights and dinged it up very, very badly, I was ultimately able to kill both of those regiments for only the loss of a couple of stands of Knights, because they ran all the way forward with no support. There's nothing in Ryan's list that really gives him capacity to support those units. And so once they made contact, I just shot and beat the absolute crap out of them. And with 2 units of Flame Berserkers and an Ardent down for the loss of only 110 points of my stuff, that is a very bad way to start the game. Now, the space that those Flame Berserkers bought, Ryan used, right? He got, you can actually see this conflict happening here. The unit of Initiates with the Hold Reg made it onto the central zone, and once he is touching that zone, he wins it. That's the advantage of playing the Hold Reg, is that he just takes any zone that he touches no matter what I do. So 100 Kingdoms scoring advantage, etc., none of that applies. However, in head-to-head, that just doesn't really matter very much. My opinion of basically every scenario in Conquest is that every scenario in Conquest is kind of secretly an attrition scenario. There are only a very small number of scenarios that can be won by scoring aggressively, and that's it, that's all you do. But head-to-head is decisively not one of those, because it has kill points. Because it has kill points, even if you give up a little bit of space early, provided you win in that location in the end, you will comfortably equalize the score because of all the kill points you pick up murdering all of the things in that space. And that is basically what happened here. I had 2 kill points from each of the Flame Berserker units. I would eventually get 2 kill points from the Initiates. I'd have 4 kill points from the Hold Reg, 2 from the Ardent Kerouag. And so that just adding up and adding up and adding up meant that even though Ryan got multiple turns of scoring on the central objective, which is worth 3 points per round, none of that really mattered because kill points more than equalized things. Now we can see a few other things that occurred. On the left flank, my goal was to commit just enough force to dissuade him from really aggressively pushing there, and in fact in the end what would happen is that this big unit of hindering terrain that we can see, and there's multiple pieces of hindering terrain across the center of the table, they would keep the ironclad Drake that was committed on my left, not at bay, but I would eventually be able to win that fight. Hold Warriors turned up as well, and a unit of Longbowmen plus this unit of Men-at-Arms would be sufficient to ultimately win that fight. I would pretty thoroughly full send my own knights up the board to go after things like crossbows. That was not necessarily necessary, but the crossbows were whittling away at my pieces, and I wanted to just pin a few elements of Ryan's in place there. This was a little bit of a kind of fool sacrifice, because yes, that unit of Household Knights would die. It would die to a unit of Initiates in the flank, and it would give up 6 points when it went, because that's my warlord, but they held things in place long enough to just ensure some victories elsewhere. Now, the final significant committal of Ryan's would be his second Ironclad Drake, which would come onto the table here, occupy this space, and then charge straight into the flank. We can actually see where my men-at-arms are here. That's where my men-at-arms would die. That Ironclad Drake would hit them hard in the flank and completely wipe the unit in one go. That's pretty much par for the course with Ironclad Drakes in my experience, especially when they go into the flank. But by that juncture, it was too little too late. It was too little too late because that was the Ironclad Drake's activation. He killed those dudes. The Caladburn Noble Lord in that regiment went down fighting, wiped out the last of the Initiates, and then every remaining activation of mine on that flank was just shots and shots and shots and shots and shots into the Ironclad. Now, Ironclads are pretty durable, but they do not withstand 16 stands worth of aimed armor-piercing shooting into them in a single turn. That would decisively win me the right flank. There would be some cleanup work against forces that trickled in to try and reinforce, but they arrived too little too late to be decisive, and due to basically a little bit of positioning and a little bit of luck, I would eventually win the left flank as well. And so because of that, I was able to push forward across both flanks. We would eventually kill the last of Ryan's regiments on turn 8, and that would end this game 56 to 18, 100 Kingdoms way. Now, I feel very slightly sorry for Ryan because he got the bye in round 1 and came off the bench to play into me, but he was an absolutely wonderful opponent and an absolute gentleman. Took it with very good grace and played very well. And I think it's to his credit that the score, despite the fact that the scenario is very bad for his list, the score was either in his favor or even for almost the entire of the first half of the game. So well played by Ryan, but ultimately a 100 Kingdoms victory. Now, round 3 would be the 100 Kingdoms mirror match. In fact, the only 200 Kingdoms players at the event, into Josh's cavalry-heavy Orders feudal list. Now, this is one of the lists that I had actually hoped not to play against, but the nature of any 5-round event is that if out of 24 players there are 5 or 6 opponents that you think are genuinely strong and credible threats to your run, across those 5 events, sooner or later you are just going to have to bend over and take the pineapple and deal with running into a bad matchup. And I do think this is certainly a challenging matchup for my list, but it's challenging in a really fascinating way because there are very, very asymmetric strengths at play between our two lists that make for a very interesting and very different game. Now, as a reminder, we can see Josh's list there on screen. He has a Priory Commander with Tip of the Lance and Caladburn in a unit of 3 Sealed Temple. These things are monsters. If they get to charge, the combination of impact attacks and regular attacks and Cleave and Caladburn on the Priory Commander is very, very capable of one-shotting any of the regiments in my list. This warband is rounded out by a second unit of Sealed Temple and then 2 units of Order of the Ashen Dawn. We then, in our second warband, have a Mounted Lord Warlord with Oliphant's Roar and Art of War, with a unit of 5 Household Knights, 3 Household Knights, and then 2 units of 3 Veteran Squires. All of those will be Veteran because of the Noble Lord's Supremacy ability. Now, if you are the kind of person that thinks activation advantage is decisive, it may be a surprise to you to learn that I consider this list terrifying into mine, because this list, even with Art of War, has 11 activations and I have 16. If activation advantage was the sole determinant of control over the game, you would think that I would have a colossal advantage. That is absolutely not the case. And the reason why is how this cavalry list plays. Because squires are, firstly, hugely resilient to range damage, the expected damage into a unit of mounted squires is not much more than 0 with a unit of longbows. But because they are very, very fast, they set a reinforcement line off of a 19-inch movement forward on the first turn, which gives you something like a 16.5-inch reinforcement line. That then sets a line which I can't interfere with, I'm not fast enough, for the 2 most dangerous medium cavalry, the Sealed Temple with the Priory Commander and the Household Knights with the Noble Lord, to arrive and just begin a decisive clash immediately. And what that means is that this list accelerates all the way through the skirmish phase of the game. Whereas my list, and in fact many lists, will want to carefully develop posture, position, maybe do some poke damage. This list says, no, we're not having any of that. It's turn 2 and everything's in place. It's turn 3 and we're fighting. I am not giving you 5 turns to deal chip damage to my list. I am not waiting for you to form a careful formation. Turn 2 we potentially be in melee, and turn 3 we absolutely will be, as the squires connect potentially and then the elite cavalry connects. And because this list accelerates so quickly through those early posturing phases of the game and just moves on to a decisive conflict as early as turn 3, it effectively shortcuts through those parts of the game where activation advantage is most important. Because by the end of turn 2, it will be in a position where the supremacy roll on turn 3 is important because activating first and deciding who gets to charge who is going to be a colossal deal. That also very naturally leads into a supremacy turn. I have found playing lists like this that you just pop supremacy early in order to ensure either a decisive strike or to ward off a blow that gets in first. And once the melee is joined as early as turn 3, potentially even as early as turn 2 if the squires connect at that time, you just have this big hot mess in which the force concentration of these elite cavalry regiments and the mobility, especially of the sealed temple, is decisive. It just skips past all of the bullshit my list wants to do and goes straight to the fight. Now, this is also helped in many respects by the fact that Josh is kind of uncanny in his ability to get both units of Order at Ashen Dawn on turn 3. But his reinforcement rolls otherwise would not necessarily be fantastic, and that would be very, very significant to the game. Now, for all that this list does a really good job of just saying, I don't care about activation count because we're going straight to the part of the game where the first 3 activations are the most important, there are some advantages that I have against them. And the first of them, and this is going to be a recurring theme for every remaining game in this recap, is that Josh's entire list is silhouette 2, or size 2, sorry, infinity terminology there. And because it's size 2, if I can form line, shields in front, bows behind, then I have a really, really nice firing line to just slowly accrue value if I can just keep that decisive clash from being decisive. And that means that even though Josh nominally has almost the same regiment count as me, and has 2.2 units, 260 point heavy regiments, which can at least theoretically outweigh anything that I might try to curry against them, the late game, if I can bring the battle to an organized state where we do not have that raging chaos of the early clash that Josh is trying to bring to bear at play, and in fact matters are we are back in the posturing stage where lines are being formed and I can just keep the game disciplined and not with surges happening, I think that favors me significantly, and so all of my play would be toward the idea of making sure that was what happened. So the scenario that we are playing for this round 3 is Breakout, which I think is fine for both players. It's fine for Josh because he is very good at getting onto those zones early, and because of the reinforcement line the Squire set, he can easily seize both outside zones if he has good reinforcement rolls, and I don't have the means to contest them, not with the pieces that I have. But it is a scenario where there is plenty of scenario scoring through the mid and late game, and so if I can bring the game to that point where I'm able to slowly build that formation and then advance it forward, there's plenty of scoring opportunity for me at the end of the game, and that is basically true of all Conquest scenarios. Just as a little bit of commentary, one of the things that you'll occasionally hear heard is that like turn 2 scoring is incredibly important. And I am not sure that's something that I hold to. There are some scenarios where it can be very significant, but the psychology of scoring is almost more important, I feel, than the actual points scored much of the time. Conquest is a 10-round game, and especially the current metagame is very, very, very early game focused. And because it's so early game focused, that in a sense actually makes early scoring less important. What I mean by that is if one player is playing a very early game kind of list and the other player is playing a very early game kind of list, then what is actually going to happen much of the time is that the attritional elements of the game will enter a solved state earlier than usual. Two early game lists or early game capable lists fighting one another early in the game is going to produce a decisive resolution maybe a turn or two earlier than they would with a slower rollout of each force. And because of that, there is a proportionally longer tail in which uncontested scoring can be secured in every single scenario. And so we can actually kind of see that in the philosophy of my list, where yes, it is capable of rolling out very early, but it is doing so with the goal of actually establishing an eventual attritional lead, whereby the opposition is tabled and it gets to score in a comfortable and uncontested way until it wins the game. So that bit of commentary notwithstanding, Breakout is relatively comfortable for both players, but it's going to be early game favored towards Stefan. Sorry, towards Josh. Josh, Stefan. Now, Josh's early reinforcements are going to be fine. Both squires will turn up. My reinforcements will be pretty mid once again, with the 2 units of wizards and just 1 unit of longbows turning up. I'm fine with this. It's totally okay. My experience with light reinforcement rolls is that it almost never matters if they fluff around, because they will ultimately be present in sufficient force by a sufficient time that I'm not concerned. Now, in this game, Josh splits his squires. One of them is going to go after and aim to destroy that central objective to open up points and scoring opportunities, and the other is going to push towards my pieces, which I will respond with. One of the things I was concerned about was that Josh might actually group his squires together. I mentioned that there were maybe half a dozen lists at this event that I was genuinely concerned about the matchup into, and I put some thought or practice into each of those just because you have to put respect on the name of players like this or they will take you down. Josh's was a list where I'd actually tested a couple of different ways that early games could develop in different scenarios. And the general conclusion that I had was I was most scared of the possibility that he might group the squires together. The reason for that, as I mentioned, is that one of the things that his list can do is accelerate the game into a quick, messy early melee that results in a decisive clash early in the game. If he splits his squires and I can get a pick against one, I can start to control that a little more. But if he keeps them together, it is not possible for me to force concentrate sufficiently to put them both down. And if they are both still intact, they can screen for elements like the sealed temple and just make it so that I can't form my formations up in time. So Josh split his squires and one of them went off against this objective, which I was very happy with because it meant that I could deal with the other one. And we can actually see the other squire on my right moving forward, and they are being opposed by the fire wizard over here. She is my best piece for dealing with the squires. Because squires only have tenacious against ranged attacks, the firebolt will absolutely mess them up. And the position that we've adopted here with our very limited reinforcements is a concave, whereby if the squires go into either of these two regiments with a march charge, firstly, they're not likely to do terribly much damage, but then they are going to get cleaned up completely. If they charge into the longbows on the left, I will be bringing a Noble Lord forward. Those longbows will be, look, they won't be doing that much damage, but they do still have Cleave 1 attacks. But more importantly, I will be firing into them with spells from both of the wizards and flank shots from the crossbows and march forward and shoot at point blank range shots from further veteran longbows. And that actually is enough to start punching through. I had a fairly clean expectation of killing them if they went into either of these two regiments. Of course, if they go into the mercenary crossbows just clap them back in melee, but more importantly, the wizard firebolts at point blank range, and I get flank shots with this aiming unit of veteran longbows on the left, which again will do huge damage even through tenacious. So because the squires were not grouped, one of them was just going after an objective, I have a means of killing the one on the right, and if I can just kill the one on the right, we have a position where we can set up a decisive engagement. Now, Josh is a clever player, he read that, but he also didn't have a great deal of choice. Ultimately, these squires would be coming into the longbows, and I would eventually be able to clean them up as expected. That was, however, probably secondary to what happened of significance on turn 2, which was that Josh's reinforcement rolls completely crapped out. Now, we would see both Ashen Dawn arrive on turn 3, which is kind of his signature, but the collapse of his reinforcement rolls on turn 2, right? He's rolling 3 reinforcement dice, usually expecting to get 1, getting 0 successes. I mean, it absolutely can happen. It's not a hugely low percent chance, but it is very unfortunate because it means that rather than presenting 2 very powerful knight regiments arriving on the second turn, he has ordered on the household knights because they have Art of War in them, and that's it. That's all he gets, which gives me a huge amount of breathing room. And what that will eventually produce is a situation where the knights move on into this position here, right, to occupy this space, and I'm able to block them up and collapse on them with everything. Now, it doesn't go all my way. I get a really cheeky flank charge. A unit of veteran longbows hits them in the flank. They're inside noble. I think they get opportunist this turn. I think it's very possible I may have popped feet that turn. And just like hits them, does a bunch of damage, but then they just clean the longbows completely up with the clapback, even though statistically speaking that was unlikely. Get a charge, kill a second unit of longbows. Those sacrifices are acceptable because ultimately the position that I've built here is one in which those knights are contained because they are bedded, they are hemmed in by longbows, and they can't really escape beyond that. The worst case scenario is that they kill both longbow regiments, and they killed both longbow regiments, but then they get charged into by the Caliburn Noble Lords regiment, cleaned up entirely, and that starts the cascade of failure for poor Josh. Now, on turn 2, on turn 3 rather, all of the rest of his stuff will arrive. So will mine, lines will be drawn, everything will turn up. But because this decisive clash has occurred at this time, I have the space that I need. Josh's stuff is now moving on from reinforcements a bit later than he would like. Everything has to kind of form up, and I am able to engineer that game state where, yes, I am hugely committed to my right flank. Everything is over there. I had to make sure that I won there so I could form line, but I did. I won there. I formed line, and the game, the pace of the game, the tempo, the rhythm of the game slowed back down, and in that, the advantage shifted back to me. And this is a very crude representation, but what we would eventually see is just enough forces of mine arrayed along the left flank to keep Josh's elements there occupied, and Josh's elements there included both units of Ashen Dawn and the MSU of Sealed Temple, and everything else concentrating on the right to eventually claim and push into this space. That would result in the destruction of the powerful unit of Sealed Temple before they were able to accomplish anything. And while a little unit of Household Knights would end up popping on my right flank, they would be dealt with by the large unit of men-at-arms before they moved out and continued on over the course of the rest of the table. Now, that would eventually produce a situation where Josh was eventually able to win these fights on the left flank, albeit with some damage, but I was able to decisively sweep the center. Now, a couple of things happen there. Firstly, I leave behind a scoring unit on this far zone. I'm occupying the center zone. The score is beginning to rapidly tick towards me. But more importantly, we have a formation where it is unit with guns, unit with guns, unit with guns, unit with guns, and it is just not possible at that juncture for these battered units of Ashen Dawn to push forward and sweep. Because, yep, sure, they might connect with one of them, but I will just put every ounce of firepower in, wipe them out, and proceed on. And even that presupposes that they can finish off the engagements on the left flank and free themselves up, which takes a considerable amount of time to do. And so ultimately, having kept intact my crossbows and two of my four longbow regiments, and my men-at-arms with Caliburn and some knights, I have enough force to sweep the field, and although it is a brutal and close run thing, there are virtually no points scored by either player all the way through till turn 5. By turn 6 and turn 7, the breakthrough has begun to occur, and even though the score is something like 7 to 12 Josh's way on turn 4, on turn 5 that flips, and then on turn 6, turn 7, turn 8, turn 9, Josh won't score more than 16 to 18 points over the course of the game, and I will eventually sweep and claim the entire table, which is going to end with a 56 to 18 win to the infantry-centric 100 Kingdoms, but only after an extremely fragile early game. Now, there are a couple of things that Josh could potentially have done differently, which we actually talk through after the game. Some of them are quite subtle, some of them not. One of the things that they could have done that would have been really good is just roll one more reinforcement success on the second turn. Now, that's just the nature of the beast for games like this, and one of the real challenges that was posed to Josh by that is that he had built the formation with the squires, kind of assuming that he would get at least average reinforcement rolls. Now, generally speaking, 1 game out of 5, sometimes 2 games out of 5, when you're only rolling 3 reinforcement dice, you're going to have those crap out on you. But the fact that it was this game where that happened was a big deal for Josh. The other sort of like little things that he could have done were just like small changes that might not ultimately have changed the game massively, but could potentially have swung things in his favor. The first was that the little unit of Household Knights that ran on over here later in the game to try and score this space shouldn't have done so. One of the lessons that kind of tricky to learn, but which Josh did recognize after the game, is that to threaten this zone, the Household Knights do not need to be in it. All they need to be is hanging out back here, 15 inches away. And if they are 15 inches away from this zone, they are within range to put a stand on it. And if they're in range to put a stand on it, then I can't ignore them. I can't just leave them there, and I especially can't just leave a crossbow unit with a wizard in there, because they will move forward and eventually kill that. So if they hang much further back, that forces me to then go and dedicate forces toward dealing with them, which keeps, for example, the men-at-arms a long way away from the battle for much longer. They would have to move all the way over to here, get that kill, and then reroute back around, and that is a much more challenging walk than just getting the kill in this space here, and then using the Imperial Supremacy to reform and begin moving. The other thing that was probably a misplay was the push from the Sealed Temple up through here. The kind of plan was for Josh to stop me for like another turn or two from destroying the objective on the right, which is the one that I needed to destroy to score this zone, but ultimately it just meant that I did too much damage to this unit and got a pick on them too early. Of all of the units in Josh's army, the one that he can least afford to give up before it does something is the Caliburn Regiment, because the Sealed Temple with the Sealed Temple Priory with Caliburn and Tip of the Lance is just so colossally dangerous, and them going down without really doing anything was was really untenable for his list. Overall, though, I would say the decisive moments for the game were the reserve rolls for Josh on turn 2, and then just more generally, my decision to take this space here, secure it completely, in order to put the game back in a position where both sides were forming line and reordering, so that the eventual clash would occur, moving left to right, with formations in a lineup of my preference that favored me rather than a chaotic mobile engagement which favored Josh. Now, that was the end of day 1. That put me 3-0 for the course of the day. There were maybe half a dozen players who were in a similar spot. In fact, no, I tell a lie. I think there were 3 undefeated players at the end of day 1, of which I was one. Now, that evening, we had a bunch of social catch-ups. We went out and got pizza. I also took steps to fix the sleeping occurrences that had occurred in and around the house on the evening before. We had an Airbnb. It was advertised as having 4 singles and 2 queens. The 4 singles were in fact creaky, child-sized bunk beds, and so at the end of day 1, after we got back to the Airbnb, I pulled a bunch of mattresses off of the beds, put them up together in a nook in a different part of the house entirely, and slept far more soundly that evening, which is a change of pace for me in terms of events. I usually sleep terribly. That meant I was in fairly good spirits heading into day 2, and those good spirits were further improved by my draw of opponent in the 4th round. I would be playing into Reese from Queensland. Reese is a Parabellum employee, an absolute legend of Conquest in Australia, and someone I'd never actually had a chance to play against before. I think I may have audibly cheered when the draw dropped because I was really excited to get a game against Reese. Now, I will also make the note that in terms of like being an opponent, I am fairly aware that I would not call myself an unpleasant person to play against, but I'm very focused. I get very, very dialed into a game. All of my attention is on it. I don't really bring a lot of energy outside of that. And I have a huge amount of respect for people who can not just focus and dial in on a game, but also bring really good social energy to the experience. And Reese is one of those players. So this was a tremendously enjoyable game. And Reese was also, on top of that, playing against Euroni, which are the game's newest faction, and which I was very excited to have an event game against. Now, this list, and spoiler alert, the list I would be playing against in round 5 are fairly similar, but to go through it in brief, we have a Kitsune Bakasu Warlord. The Kitsune is a very capable melee combatant, although against 100 Kingdoms with Untouchable on so many of our regiments, Deadly Blades does tend to have a slightly more limited effect, but she can still just do so many hits with such a high accuracy thanks to being Clash 4 with 8 attacks that she's very dangerous. She allows you to turn Fu cards into fluid formation, which is very strong, and then once per game she can pop her Supremacy to firstly allow anything to be activated by Fu, allow anything to be activated by Fu, which means that not just her regiment can benefit from that, but you also get Fu's general good effect of plus 2 inches of movement on your first march. So she's going to be in a unit of 2 Kami and an Oni. This is something that's going to change. We know that Euroni are still being dialed in by the designers. I think they came out the gate really quite well balanced. But with the tools that were available to them at Clash, Kami Oni was your kind of like go-to combat regiment. Kami being in charge, being the leader of the regiment, makes them Colossal Defense 4, which with the wound count of Oni is very, very strong. Also moves them up to Evasion 2, which can matter a lot against certain matchups. And then the Oni will be there for punch. Now, this is something that's going to change in future. All Euroni regiments, I think, are getting an extra wound. However, Kami, who would be completely busted at Defense 4 with that, are changing instead to have just +1 Evasion and Tenacious. Tenacious, however, is something that would change the matchup against my list in particular. So lots of little changes. Basically, a week after this video is released, will change this matchup. But in this particular case, we're going to see plenty of Kami Oni, because that is a list that combines the good punch of an Oni stand in the regiment with the endurance and decent brawling capability of the Kami. We've then got a pair of Tengu Ayakashi. Those are the ranged Tengu. 2 units of 2 Tengu will give a very serviceable skirmish presence to this list. Now, Tengu can be a little bit fragile, especially against my list. A bit like Squires, they're one of those units that has tenacious against ranged attacks, but not against spells. So if I can draw a beat on them with the Fire Wizard, for example, the Fire Wizard will quite reliably take out a single Tengu stand, and if you can take out one Tengu stand, you almost halve the effectiveness of this regiment, which sets you up kind of cleanly to get the kill on it in subsequent turns, etc. Now, the second warband, we have an Oyaban with Trial of Hakari-ishi. Trial gives his regiment Tenacious, and he's going to be in another Kami Oni regiment, so they will be Defense 4 Tenacious, Good Resolve, and Forward Force from the Oyaban. and then he'll have a second modular, in fact, 2 additional modular regiments of a pair of Oni Ayakashi. Oni being in charge of these rather than Kami means that they don't have that much defense. They are only defense 3, resolve 3, but they hit like an absolute truck because they have 6 attacks per stand, clash 3, cleave 2. Juggernaut is also an outstanding rule, and one of the things that we will see, basically anytime you see these double Oni regiments, they will often be operating in a support capacity, just ready to countercharge. Just, hey, are you going to charge something that is nearby? The Oni will hit you in the flank and wipe you the hell out. And that means that despite the fact that this is 160 points is not cheap as far as regiments go, they can, in combination with something like a unit of paired Tengu Ayakashi, the Tengu can move forward and poke, but just make sure that they always maintain that angle where any charge into the Tengu to stop them from shooting you will result in a flank charge from the Oni. That kind of setup and formation, 2 units, neither of them hugely expensive, but able to poke at and fend off many times their weight. Very efficient setup. Warband 3 is then a second Oyaban in, here we go again, Kami Kami Oni, and Warband 4 is a Daimyo. He has the Kenshibu Dancer Mastery, which doubles the resolve you take from hits that wounds that he deals to you. Relatively cheap mastery that increases his offensive output, and he is in just a pair of Kami. There aren't points for the Oni stand in this regiment, but because the Daimyo is 6 attacks, clash 4, cleave 2 with Kenshibu Dancer, this regiment really doesn't need any more offensive output. The Daimyo takes care of all of it. Now, while this list has a few interesting and significant strengths, I would say overall, as at Clash at the Coast, my list was quite well positioned in this matchup. The significant advantage that this list has, that it wants to leverage into my list, is mostly around deployment. Because it has 2 powerful medium regiments with flank, and because everything is medium, the list has a really nice consistent reinforcement curve where, importantly, nothing arrives on turn 1 at all. So Reese, and subsequently my opponent in round 5, Saxon, will have the advantage of seeing where all of my early deployments take place, which will telegraph how I want to play the game, but we'll be able to move enough onto the board on turn 2 to mass against wherever I am weak while avoiding wherever I am strong, or otherwise just deploying in a way that the Euroni player thinks is advantageous. I have to show my hand first by deploying my light regiments, but the Euroni get to mass and respond very, very quickly on turn 2 and turn 3. So there is kind of an idealized deployment tempo where they are deploying as quickly as I am, but it's all compressed into just turn 2 and turn 3. Very occasionally one regiment might arrive on turn 4, so they can respond very adroitly to my deployment with whatever they think is the best themselves. Now, that's kind of where Euroni advantages end in this matchup, because the big, and so there are 2 sort of significant disadvantages that Euroni have in this fight. The first is just the way that these lists are constructed. They are built with 4 characters, and each of those characters is north of 100 points. That means that the Euroni are spending almost 500 points on characters, which do not themselves add any wounds to regiments, which means that the army is surprisingly just a little bit fragile, despite the fact that individual units are very durable. Couple this with the fact that they have no healing, and the chip damage that I'm able to deal to them. If I'm able to line those longbows up and get the shots down range, and get those shots down range consistently over multiple turns, the chip damage adds up very fast and is very difficult to recover from. Now, that's something that will change a little bit in future Oni updates. One of the changes that we know is coming is that Oni are getting additional wounds and tenacious rather than extra defense from the Kami, which will help. Those wounds will make a significant difference in this kind of a list being able to arrive and connect with my list. And we also know that things like the Damaru Dashi are going to turn up, and those will add sort of like further tools in this matchup. So I'm not necessarily concerned about this matchup for Oni over the long term, but right now, at time of recording, that is kind of an issue. The second of, I would call, 3 major issues that Euroni have in this matchup is that the Euroni card deck mechanic is very powerful, but it peters out a little bit against high activation count lists. The Euroni get to activate any card of their choosing, or any regiment of their choosing, off any card of their choosing, with the little asterisk that, okay, yes, sure, that is the thing that you can do, but if you want regiments to activate at peak performance, you do need to match regiments with a certain classification of card, Fu, Chi, Ka, etc. What this tends to mean in practice is that playing against a good Euroni player is very much like playing against a player from any other faction that is playing perfectly. And that's okay, so it's a good player playing well. Like, no, no, no. Playing against Oni is genuinely like someone who is playing perfectly, someone who has exercised perfect prediction, because they will always be able to activate a regiment of their choosing at what would precisely be the best time to do it. To duplicate that effect with any other faction, you would need to be able to see the future. And there are absolutely some players, in fact, there are two players in Australia I can think of, that it is like that when you play against them, when they're not playing Euroni, it still feels like they have exercised perfect prediction. Playing against Euroni is like that all the time. Now, that's all well and good, but that only matters as long as alternating activations are occurring and the choice of those activations is very meaningful. I have 16 activations in my list. I'm just going to play the most important stuff at the end of the turn when there's no ability for Oni to respond. On top of that, I've had enough practice against Oni at this point. Not a ton, but going into the event, I had practice against Oni, that I had gotten a handle on that play pattern and had learned how to respond to the Euroni card selection advantage just by assuming that they would play perfectly. And if you just build your deck on the assumption that your opponent is going to perfectly pick the order of all of their things, it's actually surprisingly manageable. It doesn't feel great to like say it that way, but you can manage that. Now, the third and final reason why Euroni into my list in particular at the time of this event was a little bit of a rough matchup, and this is not going to change, is that they are all size 2. And so, just like in the matchup against Josh's All Cavalry list, I can form shields front, bows behind, and build a formation that is very, very good at poking and prodding into the Euroni, but presenting them only hardened targets to charge. Now, they can absolutely clear out any of my melee infantry with a charge clash if they're allowed to do so, but then even if they do so, I am still able to then just turn every gun onto them and wipe the regiment out. And unlike Josh's All Cavalry list, the Euroni have to develop and build up their forces like a normal army. They're all speed 6. Yes, you've got a little bit of foo card play. Yes, you can do some very cool stuff with reinforcement lines with the Tengu, but those reinforcement lines don't come into play until turn 3. It is on the whole a slightly more moderate, slightly more managed run out, which means that unlike against the cavalry list where I had to scramble and overcommit force to build the formations that I needed, I could just do so comfortably and predictably against the Oni. Now, this game is going to be Divide and Conquer, which is a pretty neutral scenario as far as these things go. This is one of the few scenarios where my early scoring is a little bit difficult to exercise easily because you have to move so far forward to get onto those small zones, definitely into threat range. And just more generally, this is a scenario where all of the scoring happens in the last half of the game in any case. It would take a decisive fight and the resolution of that decisive fight for any meaningful scoring to be made. And in fact, if we look at the score in this game, on turn 5, halfway through the game, the score is 7 points to 4, my way, admittedly, but like almost nothing has been scored. Divide and Conquer is a very live scenario, but only in the sense that the goal of the scenario is to force players not to be passive, which is the first goal of any scenario, and thereafter it's very much okay, cool, are you paying attention? Right, fight it out, thank you very much. Now, that did have the knock-on effect, in fact a really interesting knock-on effect, of this was one of the most patient games I have ever seen played by either player. Very, very often in Conquest, you will have games where the mental pressure to do something, to do anything that is very, very human, gets the better of either or both players. Often, the hardest thing to do is to not use all of your movement, to walk backwards if the case may be, to just be passive until the time is right. It is hugely difficult to do that, and both players in this game, myself and Reese, just played in a way that I can only describe as like extremely respectful of each other's deadly capabilities. It was fascinating to play. I've never played any game that rolled out at such a temperate and measured pace because both of us was well aware that to overcommit and give up a regiment could immediately have a decisive and knock-on effect that just was not manageable. And so it was super, super interesting and quite unlike any other play experience. Now, I mentioned that Reese in this matchup, Euroni in general, would have the opportunity to respond to my deployment. The response to that, particularly in a scenario like Divide and Conquer, is to just have a deployment that's like, okay, cool, I'm going to concentrate all of my strength, you deal with it. And so what we have, and we can see the beginnings of this rollout here, where on my right flank, I have put like basically everything. There is a tiny little bit of force on my left flank, and we would never see a great deal more committed to this, right? My left flank is a unit of knights with the warlord, which we can see over here, and a unit of veteran longbows, and those will be moving forward and then moving backwards and moving backwards and moving backwards, just giving up space. One more unit of longbows would turn up, but they would do the same thing. I would end up pulling these regiments all the way back, like way past anything, just to a point where the knights were able to charge into this zone if needed, and no further. And the reason for that, frankly, was a unit of Tengu, Ayakashi, and an Oni. For much of the early game, like I have an activation advantage, but it's 4 activations in this particular matchup, and I can't bring that activation count to bear everywhere, and it is the right flank that is going to be the most important. And so the withdrawal back for like 7 turns, a unit of Tengu would move forward, and a unit of Oni would move forward next to them, promising that if the Tengu got like, what if the knights wanted to march charge? If they did, they would get countercharged by the Oni and wiped out. And so for the entire game, basically on this left flank, it's just me giving up space and pulling back because I need to, because if I don't, then I will just lose pieces there. But as part of this fall back, there are 2 units of longbows that are shooting and shooting and shooting and shooting and would continue to shoot for like 7 turns of the game. And the output that that would produce, not because the Tengu couldn't extend any further either, because if the Tengu really overextended, they would get charged by the knights. This play and counterplay ultimately, yep, it saw a couple of knights take wounds and go down, etc., but it let the longbows put damage into Reese's regiments as they advanced along my left flank. Along my right flank, things were messy but ultimately under control. I say messy because you can see these buildings that are up against the table edge in both cases. These are large and impassable, and I am having to funnel my entire army through this relatively narrow space. Now, I made the decision to do so because I figured it would be as difficult for Reese to do the same, right? I thought that there was a slightly higher chance that Reese would move through the wider open space, and so I wanted to oppose him. He didn't because he did not want to oppose my center of strength, but it meant that I had to move through a congested area. There were some very tight and very careful movements. Much of my time over the first few turns was spent just making sure that everything could move in place. Ultimately, on my right flank as on my left, Reese would move models. We can see sort of like there's this marked out space here. He would move models up toward my right flank, but he would be very careful in their rollout. He would refuse to give me easy longbow shots for as long as possible. And only once everything was fully committed did he surge forward. Now, this is good practice, right? If your opponent is trying to do chip damage to you, you want to avoid giving them chip damage for as long as possible, and then surge forward once target saturation has been achieved, right? Push forward so many things that they can't be whittled down and destroyed as they approach. That is exactly what Reese did here. The only sort of like problem, quote unquote, is that that gave me time to build my firing lines and build my formation. Now, even then, it was challenging to get everything done. The most difficult maneuver of the entire game was coordinating the movements of the 2 regiments currently highlighted in red. So the first is the Fire Wizard, who had moved forward to seize territory, and I had to make the call, I think, as early as turn 3, whether or not she would move backwards. And eventually I made the decision that she would. She'd reform, she'd fall back, she'd try and make space back here, which was essential because there were only there were Oyaban-led regiments moving forward, which if they hit her would potentially kill her. The second very complex maneuver that needed to take place, and this took place sometime on like turn 5, was clearing out all of the space that I needed to make a subsequent charge. Now, sometimes Conquest is just a game of this where you have to just make sure that there is space to do what you wanted to do. The play that would end up being made is that these longbowmen would move a little bit to the right, and this wizard would move like just into kind of like an awkward reform situation where she would position after the reform, just something like this, because the Oyabun's regiment had moved up to here. And so what I needed to do was make sure that it was possible for this regiment to reform into the space behind her, but still have distance for them to auto-charge, and have space between these 2 regiments that a 1-inch push would move her back. And after a bunch of careful checking and finagling, I was able to engineer that, and that meant that this very annoying, very dangerous, tenacious Oyaban-led Kami regiment got hit by the full might of a Caliburn eccentric fighting style Noble Lord, plus a bunch of other chip damage, and it collapsed, it broke down. Now, that is not a hugely unlikely outcome because that Caliburn Noble Lord regiment absolutely cranks. However, the second significant thing occurred immediately after. That was basically the last action of, I want to say, turn 4 or turn 5. And the first action of turn 5 or turn 6 was that I would win a supremacy roll that I was disadvantaged on. 1 in 3 chance, happens 1 in 3 times. I popped Imperial Supremacy, and that let this regiment, right? So Eric's regiment over here, the Caliburn Lord's regiment, was sort of positioned like this, ready to be flank charged by potentially multiple regiments, setting up a failure cascade. Instead, it was able to free reform and charge, and while it didn't actually do terribly much damage, it set up a situation where now I was going to survive multiple turns and I had Reese jammed in. From there, basically things would go my way, certainly aided and abetted by some absolutely terrible defense dice. There was one situation where, in particular, a unit of Tengu Ayakashi on my right flank just got hit by a fire dart and went from full health to dead. It was one of those moments of like just terrible beauty where you can just see it happening and you know it's going to happen a second before it does, where I land 4 hits with the fire dart and Reese fails all 4 saves. And I think we both knew in that moment when he took 4 wounds from the fire dart, he just picked up his dice to roll his resolve rolls, and I think we both know before they hit the ground that it was going to come up 4 6s. Now, I mean, it could have been 4 5s, 4 4s, whatever, but that unit of Tengu went all the way to dead from a single spell. That's a catastrophe. The Kitsune would eventually, so the Kitsune's regiment would come on my right flank and it would break through the second Men-at-Arms unit, but it takes a long time for her to do that because she's dealing with Untouchable, and concentration of fire would eventually wait in. And so with this fight ending up, with my forces ending up sort of like pushing in this direction here, cordoning Reese off, pushing on through while forces get butted off. The Water Mage would end up running forward to this zone, for example, to seize it for the remainder of the game. That is a failure cascade that the Euroni can't recover from. By the end of the game, I would successfully push all the way up and through. The Tengu and the Oni regiment over here would be forced to commit into a fight that at that point, once they had activation control that I could dedicate to that part of the battlefield, they could no longer win, and that basically rolled the game up at that point. A little bit unfortunate for Reese because especially those decisive few moments that were the product of so much patience and so much care by both of us collapsed in my favor and allowed me to push forward. Whereas what might have happened in any number of other alternate histories is that the fight was like rough and brutal all the way across the center for multiple turns that could easily have occurred. But in the end, a little bit of dice went my way, and the breakthrough was mine to make towards Reese's side. And at that juncture, all of those little incremental advantages that I mentioned about how this matchup can marginally favor, or significantly in some cases favor, a gun-centric 100 Kingdoms list fell in my way, which put me as one of only 2 undefeated players going into the final round. Now, round 5 would be Euroni once again playing against good mate of mine, Saxon King from Nara. Saxon had been a practice partner of mine in the run-up to the event, part of why I was relatively comfortable into the Oni matchup. Saxon had also done me the wonderful favour of clearing out one of the other lists that I least wanted to play against over the course of this event, which was a Steel Shaper-led double Ironclad Dragom list. He took that player, Will, down in round 4 and set us up for the pairing in round 5. Now, Saxon's list is very, very similar to Reese's. In fact, it is identical in most respects. The main differences are that Saxon has 2 daimyos rather than 2 Oyabans. The daimyos mean that the list does not have access to a second model with flank. It needs to just raw dog those reinforcement rolls, which makes it more likely that there'll be a model coming on turn 4 than there is in Reese's list. But the payoff is that you have 2 daimyos rather than 2 Oyabans, and the damage output difference between a daimyo and an Oyaban is significant. Otherwise, the ability loadouts are fairly similar. In Saxon's list, there's no Tenacious. Instead, he has spent those points on the Hachiwa Mastery on the Daimyo, and Kenshibu Dancer has gone on the Kitsune. Now, Hachiwa is the ignore hindering effect, and that makes for a very interesting and tactically flexible regiment, because the Daimyo is a car character at time of recording. That's something that will change moving forward. What that means is that he can activate his regiment. He can activate with a car card, which will give +1 impact and brutal impact, I want to say, to his entire regiment. Brutal impact in particular being the important thing, but extra impact's also very strong, which makes his regiment into something of a dangerous impact regiment. When you combine that with the ability to ignore hindering, you open up threat ranges that might not otherwise be available to Oni. Yes, this is a Kitsune Warlord regiment, army rather, which means that you have access to fluid formation and a turn of foo cards and etc. etc. But ultimately, Oni are still generally sitting at movement 6, some movement 7, that's basically that, without a lot of really significant threat extenders. And so having a regiment that can theoretically, late in the turn, have the daimyo activate with Ka, and then potentially on the Kitsune's supremacy turn, have the regiment itself activate with Fu, and then march forward 8 and then charge 6 plus d6 through hindering terrain with impact attacks that are genuinely dangerous, it opens up a piece of like a tactical option that Reese doesn't have. Now, the downside of that is that you have less consistent reinforcement rolls, you don't have Tenacious in the list, etc. These are genuinely trade-offs. Saxon, I know, prefers his version, Reese, I suspect, prefers his version, but ultimately these are very small variations on what is otherwise essentially the same list. The regiments are identical, the configuration of most of the list is identical. Now, this is something that I suspect, I think actually from speaking to especially Saxon since the event, this is something that has already changed. Both players are probably refining, and as more regiments open up especially, and the moving parts available to Oni become a little bit more variable, both players will absolutely diverge in terms of where their lists are going, in small or large part. But it was very amusing that I played round 4, and then turned around and played round 5 against basically the same list. Saxon, however, is a wonderful opponent. I've had many, many games against Saxon. He's a very, very strong player. He is marginally newer to Conquest than I am, but the foundations and fundamentals are strong, and this is not the first time I've played him during an event, or I think even during the finals of an event. Now, in this mission, we are playing Declined Flank, and I actually, often in Conquest, like you will arrive at a table, you will see some terrain, you'll be like, oh, I'll just fix this terrain up because it was set up for the previous scenario. Because this was the finals, I actually called the TO in and said, Mark, I don't want to touch this terrain. Can you set a table up for us, please? Which he did. And so what we have here is Declined Flank with a fairly significant, both this is a significant scenario and this is a significant terrain setup. I'm going to just break through what's going on with the terrain here. There is impassable terrain on both sides, but in both cases it has been kind of pushed back toward the back of the table. In fact, mine is going to be probably somewhere like all the way back here out of frame, which means that this is mostly not an impassable table. There is ample movement to move forward position and importantly spread out, which means I can form quite a long line. But then beyond that, much of the table is set up to be, the terrain is set up to be relevant on the approach rather than necessarily congesting the middle of the table. There are 2 large forests, but they are offset and not toward the center. And then there is water, which is being played as water and hindering along the flanks, which is relevant more for Saxon than it is for me. And so these are pieces of terrain that, yes, the forest terrain, Saxon is going to be able to occupy that, limit some of the damage coming his way kind of on turn 2 and turn 3. Or perhaps not limit the damage, but make those units safe from being targeted because I'm not going to shoot a unit that is in forest terrain if I have any alternative. But ultimately what this terrain will let me do is form a really nice, long, clean line across the many scenario zones in this list and kind of dare the Oni to respond. And so although I have definitely pursued a policy of force concentration in this scenario, and you can see here like all of these units with guns that have formed up behind the shield wall, right? There is ample force being concentrated into this space. I have nevertheless had the luxury of spreading my army a long way out, which is something that favorable for me, less so for the Oni. On top of that, this is a scenario where my list especially can score a whole bunch of points early. At the end of turn 2, the score was 6-0 my way, because Saxon had declined to move on to either of the 2 zones that I had left live. And the reason why he'd done that is that at the end of turn 2, I had a fire wizard sitting in about this space, ready to blow up anything that walked onto either of these 2 zones, and it was only the Tengu Ayakashi that could have walked onto those zones, which are, as we have seen, very vulnerable to fire dart, and so they just didn't. They didn't give me any of that, which meant that I didn't get an early attritional lead, but On the end of turn 2, it was 6 points my way. At the end of turn 3, it was 12-2 my way because of all of this scoring that I could do. Now, that alone is not decisive in this matchup, but I was very comfortable forming line, as you can see, and just saying, I'm going to keep shooting you until you move forward. You have to commit into me. You have to charge. I will keep doing attritional damage to your regiments. I will keep just weathering them down until you commit in. And so ultimately, Saxon did commit in. He bided his time. He waited for the moment where he was massed up that critical amount of force and pushed forward. And actually, for the first time in the event, I had my Noble Lord with Caliburn's unit just completely aced by some dice, to be honest, but it happens, by the Kitsune Bakasu's regiment just charge clashing into them. Now, this was a risk that I kind of had to take. She popped her supremacy. It was always something that, like, I had to give the Oni the first punch at me because they were the only card mechanic. Again, it gives that facsimile of playing perfectly. I couldn't out position my cards against them except by using the back end of the turn where I had that advantage, and so I had to give them the first punch. Now, the odds of a Kitsune Bakasu's unit shattering a unit of men-at-arms led by a Noble Lord with Untouchable isn't high, but it absolutely exists. And as happened, she rolled an awful lot of hits, and I rolled some sixes into some sixes, and she had Kenshibu Dancer, and the charge impact hits followed by the clash did just enough damage to break the regiment before I rolled Resolve, and at that point they shattered. Now, the Noble Lord did get to go down fighting, and he absolutely walloped them on the way down, but that did represent a potential breakthrough. Or it would have, except that I had built the formation that I wanted to by that time. And so, yeah, the Kenshibu was standing atop the corpse of Eric and his unit, with a unit of crossbows, a fire mage, and multiple units of longbows all just staring at her. And so they all just aimed and shot Imperial Supremacy turn and took her down in response. And so when you break down the points, that's actually a trade that's not unfavorable for me. I think I lost probably slightly more than Saxon did, but not by a huge margin. And that was just about the best engagement for Saxon. Particularly along the right flank here, everything was more or less going my way. The unit that can ignore hindering is this daimyo in the top left corner, and they were positioned elsewhere to try and deal with things on my left flank. And so ultimately the right flank kind of just was all going well. It was all going my way. The trades that I wanted to make were being made, and what would eventually happen is, yep, the men-at-arms would get hit, and on the left they would crumble, on the right they would hold, but only for a little while. But with no Tenacious and only so much defense in Saxon's list, the amount of firepower being poured into him at point blank range with aiming regiments at that juncture was just unbearable. There was no cover for any of the regiments once they closed the gap, and particularly Oni, who are spending 500 points on characters, are just not built to weather that kind of damage. Now, there would eventually be a limited breakthrough on my left flank, where this unit of the daimyo the daimyo with Hachiwa would make the trek all the way along this left flank and begin stoving in these knight regiments. These knight regiments would perform well. They would deal with Tengu Ayakashi. They would deal with the daimyo double kami regiment that would come to fight them. Like, there would be this long back and forth fight, but by the time the dust had settled, the daimyo with Hachiwa and his regiment were alive and ready to press towards me. However, they were basically the only thing that was left alive, and at this juncture I had won all of the fights on my left flank, and that same kind of formation that we saw at the end of Game 3 had formed up, where all of my range regiments had just turned 90 degrees, and because Oni are size 2, I can literally just see them. I can just march forward and shoot, first rank fire, second rank fire, third rank fire, and so very wisely, basically what happened at that juncture was that Saxon just kind of quit the field. He was like, okay, you know what, fine, yep, I can't fight you anymore. I am now playing for control points because they could be an important tiebreaker. And so the daimyo and his units his regiment pulled back to here with the intention basically of just bouncing backwards and forwards as needed between these two zones. With 12 inches of movement, you can get back and forth between one. And so even though I would be able to turn some points off, really the only goal that Saxon had was just to make sure that he could score some points before the end of the game, because there was no reasonable way I could pursue him at that juncture. One of the things he had done was wear me down to very few scoring regiments, and unsurprisingly, those scoring regiments were all fully committed, occupying this triangle of objectives, and that left me with not that many forces to pursue the daimyo. It was a very resolved game state, but it was resolved. The daimyo and his men would survive to hold, basically bounce back and forward over a couple of turns between these spaces without any real way for or any real need for me to contest. I would score all of the points I could ever score by just holding this particular triangle. Meanwhile, Saxon would score all of the points he could by just rotating back and forward between these spaces here, and so he could math the rest of the game out. That actually makes Saxon the only player not to be tabled by me over the course of the event, and produced an end result that was 50 my way and 14 his. And so that wraps up this video. That was first place for 100 Kingdoms, Wood Elf styles, 16 activations, 20 stands of range units, but ample melee as well. I really enjoyed playing this list very, very much. Particularly that ability to seize space in which to play the game and then seed that space for advantage is something that I really, really like. I like playing Conquest in that kind of attritional way, but one of the things that you have to kind of give up a little bit if you play Conquest very attritionally is the early game advantage. And so having a list that sets the starting line in a position that they can gracefully and easily move backward from, it's a very different experience and very interesting. Now, that said, and I think I mentioned this in the list review, I don't recommend this list for casual play, right? For game store, Friday night, turn up and play with your mates. If you're not practicing for an event, this is a bad casual playlist. And the reason why is that it fundamentally undermines one of the promises that Conquest makes to its players. Conquest says, this is an alternating activation game. You will go, I will go, you will go, I will go, you will go, I will go. There will never be a moment where you're waiting and getting bored. There will never be a period where time is passing without you having something to do. You will be mentally engaged for most of the entire game. And that's just not the case against this list, because you will often have 5 activations after your opponent any given turn. There are large portions of the game where they have to just sit and wait and get shot and get charged and not do anything, which does not make for a particularly interesting or engaging non-competitive experience. So while I absolutely recommend this list for competitive play, if you think you can learn how to play it, I also think you could definitely moderate the list to not be 16 activations and sit more at that like 14 or 15 very, very comfortably. I do caution against this kind of goblin mode style list in casual play. So with that caveat, very fun and very interesting. However, we are also perhaps a week away from the next game update. There are a number of changes that we know or suspect are coming that will have impacts on, among other things, many of the matchups that we would have had over the course of this event. And we also know that the designers have said, in the most recent happy hour, Leo spoke up and said that both the speed at which the game was played and came to resolution and the activation count creep that we're seeing in the game is something that they have their eye on. I think the genesis of the activation count creep that is you can see in Conquest definitely came just, I mean, it's in Conquest's DNA, because Conquest is an alternating activation game and therefore activation count is powerful. But one of the handbrakes on activation count that Conquest had was the previous rules for the supremacy role, and their change removed that handbrake and opened up certain lists like this just to become a little bit more playable. Now, we have seen examples even during this tournament, where there are lists that are ably capable of, I mean, one, just having localized activation superiority over this list that undoes that advantage, or two, just play in a way that does not allow activation advantage, time and space to work its magic. So I by no means think that activation control is the only way to play, and since it's not particularly great for competitive casual play in any case, that's probably a good thing. But yeah, I would caution against copying this list without understanding where its true strengths lie, which are in that ability to then seed and forfeit space. And in any case, a new update coming in a week or less means that there will be entirely new lists to discover, figure out, and find, and I'm very much looking forward to that. Some of the promises for 100 Kingdoms are for the Imperial Legion units to see a little bit of additional power, and I absolutely love those regiments, so I would be very keen to play that. And in any case, a bit of change in the middle novelty is always good. But super enjoyed this list, just as I super hope you have enjoyed listening to it. As a quick reminder, I cover all sorts of miniatures war games, but in particular at the moment Conquest and Infinity. And if you'd like to support the channel and the videos I'm making, you can do so via the Buy Me a Coffee link in the video description below, or by becoming a channel member on YouTube. Big thanks to everyone who has. Your support allows me to make these videos as regularly as I do. If you like this video, then give it a like. If you like this kind of content, then by all means, please feel free to subscribe. We're getting very close to 4,000 subscribers, which is very, very small by YouTube standards, but I'm nevertheless super happy with that. Otherwise, and as always, I hope very much that you've enjoyed this, and I'll see you next time.